All right. So this is the lecture over environmental policy, law, and planning. So this is going to connect directly to chapter 24 in your book. What I want to do with this lecture is go over some of the basics of different aspects of environmental policy, some of the laws, and then how do you put together a plan, an environmental plan? What are organizations associated with this? So when you see these associations pop up, and we'll talk about these more throughout the semester, you have a little bit of a background on what this stuff is. So you take a look at our picture of elephant tusks. They're all marked and stamped for identification. Ivory trade is illegal in some countries, other countries allow it. Those things keep changing. Those laws, those policies, those sometimes are a moving target. So what we'll talk about here is an organization known as CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, and talk about what they do. I'm going to take you out to their website, show you a little bit about it. So you have a little bit of a background because CITES is a pretty significant player when we talk about environmental policy or environmental law and when we're studying environmental science. So those of you who might be moving towards conservation work, working with endangered species, CITES is definitely a group you want to have a little bit of a background in. All right, so let me jump you out to their website. Give me a second to get this organized. The screen's going to get a little funny here. And let me get these guys set up here. Okay, so sorry about kind of the hiccup there with getting the website set up. The screencast program makes things a little bit challenging sometimes, but here it is. And you can easily Google cites.org, or there's actually that hyperlink in the lecture there, and I'll take you out here. So again, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, and they add of wild fauna and flora. So plants and animals. What's going on with this? What I would suggest, if you're interested in this organization, you want to learn a little bit more about it, just jump into their homepage and you go, okay, what is it? What is CITES? This is this convention. It's a voluntary thing. Organizations, countries, states, etc., can all join in this voluntarily. It began back in the 1970s. And at that time, people were like, why do we care about this? What's the big deal? We still felt we had plenty of wild resources, so there wasn't really a need. A lot of organizations and people didn't recognize that species populations were beginning to decline, largely due to human actions. So the graph down at the bottom here is actually showing the number of recorded transactions in the CITES organization. So you can move endangered species from one location to another, provided you have permission, you're not breaking laws, you're working within the CITES structure. So we're seeing an increase in this because zoos and rehabilitation facilities, educational facilities, etc., are all working towards preservation of endangered species. And the species might be endangered in one country, but there's a stable population in another. Well, we need to relocate. That's part of conservation. Sometimes you relocate parts of a population to boost a population in some areas. Well, how do you do that legally? You work through CITES. So some really good information, talks about the structure, how they work. But the thing I just want to highlight briefly, and we're not going to go in depth, and no, I'm not going to ask you guys to remember and memorize all this. We have about, globally, 5,800 species of animals, 30,000 species of plants that are protected by the CITES agreements. The goal is to protect them against overexploitation through international trade. Like, wow, I got plenty of rhinoceroses in my country, I'm going to sell a bunch to another country. We want to be careful with these things. So CITES will look at species, they will list them, and they give them appendixes, appendix 1, 2, 3, and that gives them different statuses and different, if you want to call it, rankings what can you do with that species? Is it allowed to be relocated? Is it allowed to be traded? Depending upon their appendix, you may or may not be able to do that. It may be easier, or there's going to be different restrictions based on the appendix. Okay, so again, we're not going to go into detail on this. This is just kind of a quick intro to what CITES is. So when you see that information, you know what it is. Okay, let me move you back to the regular lecture. Okay, so we're back to the regular lecture. Again, I apologize for kind of the, if you want to call it, the hiccups of moving from screen to screen. Sometimes it's very smooth and easy. Other times, based on Screencast-O-Matic, that's the program I'm recording on here, it's not as smooth and easy. So, sorry, unfortunately, limitations of technology. So, all right, so we got CITES. We understand that there are some species that are going to be challenging to work with, to trade, to move, etc. But what we want to look at is some of the basic concepts in environmental policy. What are we trying to achieve when we create environmental policies? So one of the first things with environmental policy is establishing the rules and regulations associated with the policy. And what are you trying to do? Is it animal related, like preservation of an endangered species? Is it a policy for water quality, air quality, etc.? So let's lay down some rules and regulations. Something to also remember. Money influences policy big time. That's a huge challenge, huge issue. You have lobbying groups who are funded by certain organizations. So in a certain industry, you may pay a lobbyist to go to Congress to convince lawmakers to pass a certain law. Unfortunately, that's how a lot of this works. And the challenge is a lot of environmental groups don't have the resources, the financial resources to influence policy the same way industry does. Because if you're making billions of dollars a year, you can spend hundreds of millions to get laws enacted for you to be able to make more money. But the good news for those who don't have the money, and especially in today's world, this is even more relevant or more apparent. Public opinion influences policy. So yeah, go get those social media campaigns moving. Grassroots movements, you get a lot of people moving forward, you can push an environmental policy. You move that idea to the legislators. You talk to the representatives in your district. Who's your state representative? Who's your state senator, etc. You have a large public public opinion on this. You can change things. So yeah, money is very important in influencing policy, but public opinion, I wouldn't say it's going to outweigh it, but it can, let's say, challenge that money. Not a guarantee it's going to work, but it gives those grassroots movements who don't have the financial resources a chance. Sometimes lawmakers, a lot of times, lawmakers don't want bad public opinion, so they will hopefully listen to public opinion on some of these things. So, all right, so now the basic principles behind environmental policy when we're trying to develop them, put them together, we focus on what are the human needs? Is this a policy good for us? Is this a policy good for people? And we have to look at the big picture of human needs. Is it good for us environmentally? Is it good for us financially? Is it good for us socially? Those all have to come into the picture of environmental policy. We also want to focus on, is the policy good for ecosystem health? Is this going to maintain a healthy ecosystem? And is it going to help promote sustainability? Is this something that's going to promote sustainability with this environmental policy? So lots of things to consider. It's not a clear, simple, easy thing. So the frustrating part is it's not a fast process. So you see something happening and it's not like, oh, we can enact a law and get it changed next week. Sometimes this takes months or years, or sadly, some things have they've been sitting in the court systems for decades trying to get things done. It's the frustrating part about how things work when you're dealing with the commons, public resources, public land, etc. Again, you own private property. To some extent, you may be able to do what you want on that property. So to work in this area, to develop a policy, you have to run a cost-benefit analysis. What are the direct costs? And then let's focus on the indirect costs, or direct and indirect values. So we've got a rainforest here. What's the direct value of that rainforest? Well, I can develop the land and sell 1 acre home sites for $40,000 an acre and Can I get medicine from this? Can I grow food on it? Think about all those direct values that land has. Direct often is tied to financial. What's the dollar amounts? Let me put that in here. What are the dollar amounts associated with that that resource that you're looking at? Indirect will be those unseen, let me try to center this, those unseen values. Like, does this purify water? Does this regulate climate change? Does this help with emotional and mental health and things of that nature? You can't tie dollars to stuff like that very easily. But we run a cost-benefit analysis, and that should help guide us as we're putting together our policy. And then we move that idea forward. But once we've done our cost-benefit analysis, before we jump in and go, wham, here we go, let's do this, we want to think about a thing known as the precautionary principle. So you go, okay, all excited, ready to charge forward. Let's understand the risks before initiating the activity. And then let's take a look at long-term cost-benefit analysis. So precautionary principle is, don't just jump in waist deep, dip your toe in the water, think about the risks. Is the cost worth the risk? Everybody's going to have a different opinion. So let's take a look at our forest here. What's cost-benefit analysis? What's the risk? If we take that forest out, what are we going to do? Is that worth it in the long term? That's part of a big part of the sustainability idea that we were wanting to discuss, or that we want to keep in mind. So if I take my forest out to develop it, to do whatever with it, what's the long-term positives, but also what are long-term negatives to removal of that forest? So we got this big piece of land now that's been deforested. How is that going to change the environment? What is this thing we want to call the ripple effect? All right, great. I made a lot of money on development of that land, but how long is that land going to be good? Is it going to degrade? Is it going to cause pollution? Is it going to erode? Is it going to create health issues? Those are all things we really want to be I would caution developers about, is let's think beyond tomorrow. Let's look the next generation. Again, if you're truly wanting to be sustainable, you have to think way down the road, past our lives, into our children's and our grandchildren's and great-grandchildren's lives, to say, are we doing the right thing? Short-term gain doesn't always necessitate, selling yourself short in the long term. So precautionary principle is an important thing important factor to consider. So, all right. So in the next lecture, we're going to start talking about some major environmental laws. What's out there and what do they do for us to protect us all?